Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to the Lubar Center, Eckstein Hall at Marquette University Law School. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. This is our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people we often say are doing important work in this region and beyond. Today we are joined by the Attorney General for the state of Wisconsin, Josh Kaul. Josh Kaul was elected back in November of last year. He took office in January. A little bit of background on the Attorney General. He got his undergrad degree at Yale, his law degree from Stanford. He was a federal prosecutor in Baltimore and then came back to Wisconsin, where he grew up. Came back to Wisconsin and worked for the law firm Perkins Coie and did quite a bit of work on voting rights litigation. He ran for office, I believe it was your first bid for public office, and won in a very close election. Today we're going to be talking with him about the responsibilities of the Attorney General, priorities that he talked about during the campaign, and then now he has a chance to act on. So won't you please welcome Wisconsin's Attorney General, Josh Kaul, to Marquette Law School.
Thank you, Mike, for having me. Thank you to Marquette for hosting this event, and thank you to everybody who's joined us here today.
It's great. Good to have you with us. And I'm wondering, since this was your first bid for elected office, and now that you are in the office, has it been what you imagined it would be?
It has been...
what a knowing laugh, from the audience. That was kind of interesting.
It has been eventful, but I say that in a lot of ways in a good way. Certainly there are aspects that have been more difficult than I think they needed to be. The laughter, I think, related to what happened during the transition in the lame duck session. As a lot of folks know, the legislature acted fairly hastily during that period of time and sought to remove certain powers to make it more difficult for me to do my job and for Governor Evers to do his job, and we are still in the process of working through that. So there are certainly challenges, but there are also incredible opportunities being at the Department of Justice. We have extraordinarily talented prosecutors and attorneys who represent the state, agents who investigate cases, and people who do a lot of other work. And they go to work to make our state safer and stronger day in and day out. And it's frankly an inspiration to work with those folks. And being able to work to get justice for Wisconsinites every day is, I think, an incredible opportunity. And it's something we take very seriously. And we certainly hope we're doing a good job at it. We're going to keep working hard at it.
I do want to spend some time talking about the challenges. And you referred to the legislation that was passed in December in an extraordinary session. Some people refer to it as the lame duck legislation. You have said that legislation, which does in fact limit your powers to some degree, you called it an unmitigated disaster. Explain.
Well, first and foremost, this legislation was not passed because people thought it was good public policy or because it was going to help taxpayers or make Wisconsin a stronger state. It was passed because the members of the legislature and the outgoing governor didn't like the results of the last election, and so they changed the way that, among other things, settlements were resolved in Wisconsin from how they had been resolved for many previous years, frankly throughout the history of our state. And now all of a sudden they've put in place a new process for settling cases. That's problematic.
The Joint Finance Committee, which is Republican majority, the Joint Finance Committee has to decide these settlements, correct?
That's right. Either the Joint Finance Committee has to approve of certain settlements or a legislative intervener needs to. So that's problematic just because it is inconsistent with our fundamental democratic value that elections have consequences and that the people's choices should be respected. But what's made it worse is that the legislation is, as you wouldn't be surprised to see with legislation that was rushed through, worked on over the course of a long evening and passed in the early morning hours. It's just really poorly drafted and ill thought through legislation. So for example, there is this requirement that Joint Finance approve of certain settlements, but there's no process that the legislation puts in place for how the legislature should go about approving of those settlements. So, we've reached out, we've tried to work with the Joint Finance co-chairs to set up a process that will make sure that we can handle those settlement discussions in a way that protects the confidentiality that we need to have so we're not tipping our hand about what our trial strategy might be, so we're not exposing the weaknesses in our case to the other side. So we can have those discussions in a confidential way. And so far, we have not been able to get the legislature to agree to a confidential process. And what that means is that settlements are on hold. And that means
How
that,
many settlements?
so there are, I believe it's 16 cases that we have sent over to the legislature. It's somewhere in that neighborhood. It impacts cases at the settlement stage because we need to get their approval for certain settlements. And these cases, by the way, these are cases like environmental enforcement actions where we have filed a suit against a polluter, and now we're asking them to be held accountable. They're consumer protection actions where somebody has made false or misleading claims. And they can be cases where the state is being sued, and as part of that resolution, part of what we're trying to do is to settle it in a way that's going to be most helpful for the taxpayers so we don't lose state dollars. Right now, those settlements are on hold, but it also impacts our cases throughout the process because one of the things you think about as you file a case and as you allocate resources is this a case that's likely to settle? So it has an impact not only in those cases that are currently teed up, but also in all sorts of other cases.
Can you quantify in dollars what's at stake right now because these settlements are on hold?
There are tens of millions of dollars at stake, and if this persists, it will probably be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. This is a really significant issue for the state of Wisconsin, and the Joint Finance Committee, they have given themselves this power. Now they need to take the responsibility that comes with that to step up and put in place a system that's at least going to be workable. It's a really bad situation even if we get to that point, but we are working hard to make the best of that bad situation because we've got an obligation to Wisconsinites, to the taxpayers. We've got to make the best of this law so long as it's in place. We're trying to do that, but unfortunately we haven't been able to get the Joint Finance Committee to agree on a process that works.
I don't want to get too far into the weeds on this, but I will ask you about some recent developments. So you went to the Joint Finance Committee and you said, I want to talk about a potential settlement here, but I'd like you to, and correct me if I'm wrong, sign a confidentiality agreement, basically say I'm not going to talk about this. And the legislature and Republicans in the legislature balked at that. They said this should not be done in secret. We're concerned about secrecy here. Please, okay? Was there a way other than to go to them and ask for a confidentiality agreement to proceed with this?
The only other options are, first of all, they could change the law so that we no longer have to go through this procedure, or they could say, you know what, we trust the Attorney General to resolve cases. The Joint Finance Committee doesn't typically go into closed session, so we're not going to change our practice. But the problem is that, when you're considering settlements, first of all, sometimes we have obligations because we've entered into a common interest agreement where we've agreed to keep information confidential. So, even if we wanted to give information, we'd have restrictions in place. But also, think about, the Packers. They're playing the Vikings this coming Sunday. They're not going to put their playbook out for discussion with the public before they go play the game on Sunday. It's going to put the Vikings at a big advantage. Well, likewise, we don't want to lay out all the details of our thoughts on litigation in a public forum where the other side in the case can see that information so that if the case doesn't settle, we're going to be at a disadvantage because it's going to cost the state money. It's going to cost taxpayers if we do that.
Well, one of the Republican co-chairs, John Nygren from Marinette, from the Marinette area, said, I just think there's got to be another way forward to resolve this. Do you agree? And what does that other way look like?
So we have made some suggestions for how we can move forward. We've suggested a proposed process. We offered a confidentiality agreement. But so far they have not come up with a way that will maintain confidentiality. They suggested that they go into closed session. They said that would maintain confidentiality, but the Legislative Reference Bureau said that's not correct. They said that they could have a lawyer sign a confidentiality agreement on their behalf. The Legislative Reference Bureau said that doesn't bind the members. So the solutions they have offered so far haven't worked, and they haven't come up with one that does. And they need to either come up with something or they need to actually agree with what we've suggested so we can move forward.
What kind of urgency is there to this, in your mind?
It's hard to say, and the reason is settlement opportunities can come up and need to be resolved very quickly. So we have worked hard to prevent there from being problems that result, but it is certainly possible that there could be some litigation where we get a settlement agreement, an offer that comes in that we think is good for the state, and we've got to decide in a very short time period. Right now, the legislature hasn't even worked out the process for how we consider this. And it's important to remember, this is all totally unnecessary. This is all a product of the lame duck legislation that was enacted to bring more power from the executive branch into the legislative branch because of the results of the election. So the easiest fix is just to get rid of this mess and clean it up.
You want to repeal, but I'm sure you would, as a pragmatic guy, you would say that's not likely to happen, correct?
We're trying to work within the legislation that's in place, like I said, make the best of a bad situation. But the legislature is at a point now where there are serious consequences the state can face if they don't move forward. I mean, this shouldn't be a partisan issue. This is just common sense, making sure that we're protecting taxpayers and protecting our ability to enforce environmental laws, consumer laws, and other laws.
In any sense, do you feel like these limitations on your authority have made you more of a figurehead than the state's top cop?
I don't think that. I mean, it has definitely impacted the authority we have in the office, and in cases where this legislation affects what we're able to do, it undoubtedly has an impact. But fortunately, there are, first of all, we are able to bring cases regardless of what the legislature thinks we ought to do. So we can still file cases. We can resolve certain cases in certain ways. But it has an impact, there's no question about it.
Let's talk about a couple of big cases right off the bat. One that you have been able to take action on, and you kind of used a window that opened up to take advantage of this. During the campaign, you said that you and Governor Evers wanted to pull the state out of a lawsuit that was challenging the constitutionality of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. You were able to do that, correct?
Yes, we were. We have withdrawn the state from the lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. And if that suit is successful, it's still pending, but Wisconsin is no longer a part of it. Protections are going to be eliminated for people with a pre-existing condition. Young adults would lose the guarantee that they can remain in their parents' coverage until they're 26. And probably over 20 million Americans would become uninsured. The idea that we would be using state resources to litigate that case, to me, is just hard to believe. So I am really glad that we have withdrawn from that suit.
And the limitations on your power did not apply then because
the law was temporarily enjoined. It was blocked from being in effect.
By a lower court.
So we had a window of time when we were able to exercise the powers that were in place when I was elected for the Attorney General. And so we did so. We withdrew from that case.
Bring us up to date on the state's involvement in the opioids epidemic lawsuit. So back in May, I think it was, you decided to have Wisconsin get in on this and basically say that, we think that the maker of OxyContin, Purdue Pharma, and its former co-chair, Richard Sackler, bear responsibility for what has happened in Wisconsin and frankly in other places around the country. What is the status of that case? What can you tell us about where it is today?
So our suit against two entities, two Purdue Pharma entities, and Richard Sackler, who's a former president and co-chair of the board for Purdue Pharma. We filed that case, as you said, in May. The initial parts of that case are taking place right now, so we'll see a response from Purdue, I think, fairly soon. But there are also a lot of lawsuits against Purdue around the country. There's a multi-district litigation in Ohio, and that involves all sorts of cities and counties and others. And then a lot of states have filed suit as well. On top of that, there's a multi-state investigation that was announced under my predecessor into other manufacturers, in addition to Purdue, of opioids. And since I've taken office, we've joined a multi-state investigation into opioid distributors. What's really critical to me is, first of all, that we, figure out exactly who's accountable, who engaged in illegal marketing or other practices that contributed to this epidemic, and that we hold them accountable. I think that's critical both when it comes to fighting this epidemic, because there is a lot of money, billions and billions of dollars, that pharmaceutical companies have made off of the sale of opioids, and recouping some of that money so we can put it towards treatment and prevention efforts and enforcement efforts, I think, is important. But it's also important that we have a clear understanding of what led to this epidemic. I think that's going to help us address it more effectively and hopefully prevent another epidemic.
There are some rumblings that Purdue Pharma or the Sacklers might declare bankruptcy. What does that do if they were to say, sorry, we can't do this?
Yeah, and I won't comment on any of the specifics of what's been reported, but what I can say is that if there is a bankruptcy proceeding, the state of Wisconsin will continue to pursue recovery from the bankruptcy estate and from this claim we have against Mr. Sackler.
Well, let's talk in greater detail about the opioid epidemic. This is something you talked a lot about during the campaign, and your predecessor talked a lot about it during the campaign. The latest numbers I've seen showed that in 2018, there were 838 overdose deaths in the state of Wisconsin. That actually was down 10% from the year before. First time the number's gone down, I think, since 2015. Have we turned the corner on the opioid epidemic?
I think it's a yes and no answer. There are, I think, a few different components of this we need to think about. One is, this epidemic has resulted in large part because of this huge increase in the prescription of opioids. If you look at the numbers from the mid-90s compared to now, the numbers are up dramatically. And one of the things we allege in our case against the Purdue Pharma entities and Richard Sackler is that was in part due to a concerted effort by those defendants to mislead the public, including prescribers, about the dangers of opioids and about the benefits of opioids. And so the good news is, in the last few years, we've finally started to see a reduction in the volume of opioid prescriptions, and that's a really good sign. We have a lot of room to go when it comes to reducing prescriptions, but we're moving in the right direction, and that means that fewer people will likely get addicted to opioids. The one thing, though, that we have a real issue with is there are people who've become addicted who seem to be switching to illegal opioids, heroin, and fentanyl, which is a real concern because of its extreme potency. And we need to make sure that people who are addicted, if they're no longer being provided with prescriptions to opioids, that we have processes in place, structures in place, so they're getting the help they need, so they're getting treatment and not ending up just switching to illegal narcotics. And what concerns me is, the influx of fentanyl, of heroin, of meth. So while the decrease in prescriptions is a really good thing, we've also got to work to fight those illegal drugs.
I wanted to ask you about what's happening in Milwaukee County specifically. We know the opioid epidemic affects all parts of Wisconsin. That's not a secret to anyone in this room. But some places are being hit particularly hard. The medical examiner in this county said that we're on a pace for 420 overdose deaths. There are thousands of people who overdose who never die, but 420 overdose deaths. There was a period this summer where we had 14 deaths in 4 days in Milwaukee County from overdoses. Is there special attention being paid by your office to what's happening in the state's largest county?
One of the things that we have looked at is if there are clusters of overdoses like that, is there a commonality among those? Is there somebody who is selling something that's being misrepresented to the people who are buying it? Is there something that's causing that cluster to happen? And if so, what can we be doing to address that cluster? But the fundamentals when it comes to addressing the epidemic, I think, are the same, whether you're in Milwaukee County or Sawyer County or any other part of Wisconsin, which are, number one, we've got to try to prevent people from becoming addicted. And that includes educating people about the dangers of addiction, the fact that you can be prescribed a drug by your doctor, but that doesn't mean you can't get addicted, and about the fact that pharmaceutical companies, we've alleged Purdue Pharma, has misled people about the benefits and the dangers of these drugs, and then try to prevent those drugs from being diverted so that if people have unused and unwanted medication, they're disposed of. Second, we've got to expand access to substance abuse treatment. It is too difficult to access treatment in a lot of the states. There are a lot of things we can be doing to do that. I think we need to expand our treatment and diversion programs further. We've seen some expansion, which is a good thing, and I want to see more of that. We could also significantly improve access to treatment if we expand Medicaid in Wisconsin. We'd cover tens of thousands of additional Wisconsinites, which means more people would have access to the treatment they need to afford treatment. And then third, we've got to work on enforcement rather, holding accountable those companies I mentioned that engaged in false and deceptive practices, but also targeting large-scale drug traffickers for prosecution so we can try to prevent some of these drugs like heroin and fentanyl and meth from flowing into Milwaukee and the rest of the state.
Do you think something you've talked about during the campaign and since then is that you believe that we should legalize marijuana for medical use? Do you believe that could actually help with the opioid epidemic?
I think it could, and the reason I think that is I think there are people who have chronic pain issues or other medical conditions where there's some indication that medical marijuana may be helpful. And I would rather see marijuana prescribed in those circumstances rather than an opioid in just about every case if they're both effective treatments. Now, there's no question that there should be more medical research done on how effective marijuana is at treating these ailments. The problem is, because of its status as an illegal drug, there hasn't been the kind of research you'd want to see. But what we do know is the effect that opioids have had on people who are addicted to those opioids, and those effects have been just devastating to people. And so I'd rather see marijuana prescribed in those circumstances if that's an option.
Let's spend a few minutes talking about guns and gun legislation. I think since I've seen you, certainly we've had a number of mass shootings. We had El Paso, and we had Dayton, and we had Odessa, Midland, just in recent weeks. I want to ask you about what we should be doing at Wisconsin. You said it's time for a serious debate about gun legislation. Specifically, what should we be talking about from your point of view?
Well, first, as you said, we need to have a debate. The legislature has not even held hearings regarding the legislation that we're talking about. And before they said they wanted to see legislation, well, now a group of us, including the governor, the lieutenant governor, me, and others, have announced universal background check legislation. We're also going to announce red flag legislation before too long here. I would like to see procedures in place that prevent people who we know to be a danger to themselves or to others from having access to firearms. And two ways we can do that, that broad majorities of the public support, are those solutions. Universal background checks, which are designed to prevent people who've committed, say, a felony from working around the background check system, which applies to most people. And a red flag law, a law that would allow a family member or a law enforcement officer who sees that somebody is a danger to themselves or others because they're suicidal or they've made threats, and allows that family member or officer to go to a court and to get an order temporarily disarming that person to try to prevent a tragedy from happening.
On the red flag laws, the pushback you hear, and you've heard some of it from the state legislature, Republicans in the state legislature saying, this could be too broad, that it could be an example of government overreach if it's not used correctly. They would like to see more focus on mental health issues, and we won't get into the debate over whether that's a cause of this, but they think there are other ways of going about this and have concerns about red flag laws. What would you say to address their concerns?
Yeah, well, first I would say if you do have concerns about mental health issues, the best way we can address them immediately in Wisconsin is expanding Medicaid. But that aside, with respect to the red flag law, there shouldn't be concerns because we have red flag laws in place in other states in the U.S. None of them have been found unconstitutional. And we're talking about public safety experts, law enforcement officers, or family members. There's a process in place. You'd have to go to a judge to get approval for that to happen. And the order would be temporary. Plus, you'd have some sort of penalty in place if there was some sort of false allegation made. So it's a very carefully tailored way of addressing people who are an immediate danger to others. And we have similar procedures in place in the laws already. We have restraining orders that can be issued to prevent against domestic violence, for example. And those orders can actually require removal of firearms from people. So we have a similar procedure in place. But what I'd like to do is extend it to situations where somebody can be identified as a danger to themselves or others so that we can prevent a suicide or potentially a shooting.
So you do not see overreach as a potential in this kind of legislation? I
don't see that at all. It's actually very narrowly drawn to people who are in that sort of crisis situation who've been identified as a danger.
So what, Colorado has a law similar to the one that you think could work for Wisconsin?
That's right, and Connecticut has had a law in place for I think it's about 20 years now, and it has been effective. The data indicates that it has reduced suicides in Connecticut. I think it's time for us to move forward. What I don't want to see is what we have seen time after time after time, which is inaction. I want to see the legislature take these issues up, debate them and consider them, hear from public safety professionals so we can talk about solutions.
What are the odds of that happening?
You know, I think it's a question of whether there is more pressure that continues to be applied to the legislature. The members of the legislature so far haven't done anything, but you know, the latest Marquette poll showed that about 4 out of 5 people in Wisconsin support red flag laws. About 4 out of 5 people support universal background checks. And if people make their voices heard, they reach out to their representatives and tell them that they need to take this up, my hope is that legislators are responsive. That is certainly the way it's supposed to work in our democratic system, that the legislators are responsible to their constituents, and I'm hopeful we'll see that here.
One final question about guns. When you say universal background checks, just for the folks in this room, help spell that out specifically. What are we talking about?
So right now, most firearm sales
Are subject
to a background check. The Department of Justice conducts many of them. The federal government also conducts some background checks, but not all firearm sales are subject to background checks. Private sales can be made that don't go through a background check. And what this legislation would do is require those private sales to go through a process that would ensure that there is a background check conducted. There are a few exceptions in the law. For example, if somebody obtains a firearm through inheritance, there are some very narrow exceptions. But what this law would do is prevent people from circumventing the background check laws, which apply to the vast majority of firearm purchases, by doing an online internet private sale, that sort of thing.
Something else you talked a lot about during the campaign is the testing of untested sexual assault kits. So for years, for decades really, thousands of untested sexual assault kits were being stored, but they were never tested. So I want to ask you where you are in resolving that. They began being tested in 2017. More than 4,000, I think, were going to be tested. Where are we in that? And where are we in terms of prosecutions that have resulted from this testing?
Yeah, the testing was completed late last year on all kits from cases in which there was no conviction and there was consent to test the kit. We identified a little over 300 additional kits that, pursuant to the terms of one of the grants, we thought needed to be tested. So that testing is in process and I think will be completed this fall. But one of the things that happened as a result of the testing of all these kits is that there are cases where foreign DNA samples were identified, DNA that's not DNA from the survivor but from somebody else. And there were about 1,600 of those cases. Now that doesn't mean you've got a potential prosecution in all those cases, because in some cases not enough DNA was identified that a sample could be uploaded into the DNA database. And in some cases DNA didn't lead to a match. But in some other cases there were matches that resulted from that testing process. And that means there's a potential investigative lead. Now again, in some cases the suspect was already known. But in cases where there was a potential lead, we've gone through many of those 1,600 cases, and we're going to go through all of them where there's some foreign DNA identified to determine if those cases should be investigated further and if a potential prosecution can be brought. So we're most of the way through that review, not all the way through. Criminal charges have been filed in 9 cases, and we recently had the first conviction that resulted from the testing of kits in the backlog. We're going to continue pursuing cases where investigation is appropriate. The other thing I'll mention is, one of the goals from this testing of the kits, the most important goal is to help get justice for survivors in those cases and to do what should have been done long ago. But another goal was to learn about our system and how we can improve it. And there are clearly changes that can be made here in Wisconsin that will ensure that we don't have another backlog. So earlier this year, along with a bipartisan group of legislators, I announced legislation that's designed to prevent Wisconsin from having another backlog. I believe that there's likely going to be a hearing on that legislation in the Senate fairly soon. I'm hoping that there's one scheduled in the Assembly soon as well. So we'll see what happens with that legislation, but the goal of it is to prevent another backlog in Wisconsin.
When we look back on this episode in our history, that it's almost hard to believe that for decades tests were not done. How would you describe what happened in this state during that time?
For far too long, sexual assault cases were not given the priority that they should have been given, and that is something that we have to change. For too long, I think, when a survivor would exhibit signs that they had gone through a traumatic event, as a survivor of sexual assault may well do following a sexual assault, those signs were viewed not as an indication that somebody had suffered an assault, but that they weren't credible or they weren't cooperative. with better understanding of trauma, and we continue to train on this, with better understanding, I am hopeful and I believe that law enforcement will make better decisions about those cases. And I also think there's a recognition now of the importance that DNA testing can provide in these cases. It can identify a suspect in cases where a suspect wasn't previously identified, and it can help obtain a conviction in a case where without that testing you might not have. I think that is very clear now in a way that it wasn't as clear before, but to be clear, these kits should have been tested in the first place, and hopefully this will never happen again.
You said that you want to have a new focus on environmental protection, on environmental law enforcement. Give us some examples of what you've done to live up to that pledge.
So one of the things we've done is created a public protection unit. We've merged our environmental protection unit and our consumer protection unit at the Department of Justice. And the goal is to make sure we're using our resources in those areas as efficiently as possible. And we think we can improve our efficiency by doing that. We also recently announced a fellow who's going to be joining, working as an attorney for 2 years with the department, who's going to assist with our public protection unit. And then we've worked to both withdraw from some challenges that my predecessor had filed, challenging rules that protect the environment here in Wisconsin. And we also,
such as?
So Wisconsin was involved in a case challenging what's known as the Waters of the U.S. rule. That's a rule that gave the EPA authority to enforce laws relating to certain bodies of water. We withdrew from that challenge because I want to see federal environmental protectors have an opportunity to help us enforce our laws and protect clean water in Wisconsin. We also withdrew from a challenge to a regulation that had been issued under the Obama administration protecting against mercury and air toxins, because I don't think it's in the state's interest to try to weaken protections against mercury and other air toxins. And recently we announced that we are part of a multi-state suit challenging an effort by the Trump administration to roll back a part of the Clean Power Plan, rules that relate to emissions from power plants. Climate change is real. We have to acknowledge it. And while we can't link any particular weather event to climate change, we've all seen what's going on with flooding, with, I think it was 108-degree temperatures in Europe over the summer. The effects are real and they're starting to play out, and we need to start responding to that crisis, because that is what it is. It is a crisis.
When you talk about a new focus on environmental protection, and I think this is something we actually talked about during the debate we had here last fall, there are some in Wisconsin's business community who get nervous when they hear about an added emphasis on environmental protection. They feel like business is going to be the bad guy in this scenario. Can you say anything to business people about what your intentions are and why they should not be concerned?
I think companies that are complying with the law and they are good stewards of our environment, which is critical to our economic success, by the way, because our clean water and our clean air are real assets for the state of Wisconsin. Those companies have nothing to worry about. In fact, enforcing environmental laws against companies that are breaking the law ensures that we have a level playing field for businesses to compete on in Wisconsin. And if we're thinking about how we grow the economy in Wisconsin over the long term, having strong environmental protections, having clean air and clean water, places that people want to, making sure people want to stay in Wisconsin, raise their families in Wisconsin, we benefit from having those sorts of attractions in Wisconsin. And if we, devastate a river or a lake, we lose that, and that's a harm to the state, and it's a harm to our business community.
Well, this may seem out of left field, but I think it plays off what you were just saying. I'm wondering if you're paying attention to what's happening in Michigan, where you have the Attorney General in the state of Michigan and the governor saying we want to shut down the Enbridge line number 5. This is the pipeline that carries thousands of gallons of crude oil every day through the Straits of Mackinac. There are concerns that the pipeline is old. There are concerns that the currents in the Mackinac Straits are so strong that they could cause a problem, and that you could have an environmental disaster in a lake that provides drinking water to places like Wisconsin. Are you watching that case closely? Do you have any thoughts about that case?
That is a case we're watching. What I will do is comment generally on those types of issues. There are a lot of times when there is a potential risk to the environment, but there's also potential economic benefit from certain activities, whether it's building a pipeline or whatever else. And what you've got to do is you've got to, I think, be reasonable about what are the potential harms that result from this and what are the benefits that result economically from it. And if this is a situation, if any situation is one where the risks are remote and there's not likely to be harm to the environment, that's not where our enforcement resources should be spent. They should be spent addressing clear violations or working to address some of the major challenges we face, like PFAS or climate change. On the other hand, if you've got something that is a real risk and that does pose a danger, ignoring all that, ignoring the science if it points towards the need for enforcement, I think is a big mistake. So I think you've got to move forward. But it's that sort of balance. I think you can't approach these issues with a preconceived notion that I'm always going to be on the side of preventing anything from moving forward. If there's any concern, there will be an impact on the environment. But likewise, you can't just say that what's going to happen to the environment or concerns to it are irrelevant. You've got to consider both of those things and make a judgment about what's in the best interest of the state.
Do you think oil that goes through the Straits of Mackinac is a real risk?
Well, I won't comment on the specifics of that case, which is pending. What I will say is it depends on the circumstances. If you've got best technology and there's extremely low likelihood there's going to be a problem, that's one thing. If you're using poor technology and you're putting at risk a critically important body of water, you might have a different response.
I want to ask you about something you did yesterday. 50 attorneys general in this country said, we're going to open an investigation, an antitrust investigation of Google. What are you looking for?
Well, I think as everybody here knows, modern technology companies like Google and others have become a part of daily life for many, many Wisconsinites and many, many Americans. And those companies have access to a lot of very personal information, not only information about who we are and where we live, but in the case of Google, they have access to a lot of people's emails and they have access to people's search histories. And making sure that those markets remain competitive, I think is important for two reasons in particular. One is we want to make sure that an important sector of our economy is competitive, because if you stifle competition, you stifle economic growth. But also the privacy of lots of Americans is at stake. And we want to see companies competing to be the best when it comes to protecting privacy, to be the strongest when it comes to safeguarding your data. And again, if there's one company that controls the entire market, you're much less likely to see that competition. And that's bad for consumers. So we want to make sure that competition is happening appropriately, that it isn't being improperly stifled, and that the antitrust laws are being complied with in this very important sector.
I wanted to ask you a question, and I think this may have also come up during our debate, but and I don't know if you can say anything about this or not. But back in January of this year, the DA in Milwaukee County, John Chisholm, said he'd like to work with you on an investigation that would look at the behavior of the Catholic Church in terms of clergy abuse of minors. We've heard groups like SNAP, the survivors group of clergy abuse, request that same thing. Is that something that you would look at? Have you talked to the DA about his desires?
So first, let me just say this is an incredibly important issue, and there is no doubt in my mind, or I think anybody's mind at this point, that there were some really horrible crimes that have been committed around the country, including here in Wisconsin. And those are the types of crimes, first of all, that are at the scale that they are clearly of statewide importance and are worthy of a potential investigation from the Department of Justice. That's not the right word, but they're the types of cases of statewide importance that our AG might be looking at. The other thing, though, that we have to make sure we're thoughtful about is there an opportunity for criminal prosecution in these cases? Our justice system and our investigators are well set up to investigate potential criminal activity. And if there are cases that potentially can be brought under the statute of limitations, those are the types of cases that I think are absolutely not only appropriate, but that our Department of Justice should be investigating. But if there are not cases that are under the statute of limitations, what our criminal justice system is less good at is doing an investigation for the purpose of issuing a report. Prosecutors are not supposed to be fact finders. That's for a jury to do. And while there are some exceptions, Pennsylvania issued a grand jury report, that's highly unusual in the prosecutorial context. So if the goal of an investigation is to make the public aware of what happened and to be a check on the information that's been provided, then I think you might think about having a different type of process, a public process where somebody like an independent counsel is appointed to do a public review. But the first question is, are there potential criminal cases? And if the answer is yes, then I think those cases absolutely should be investigated criminally. That's the sort of approach that I take to that sort of matter.
Can you say whether you've had any conversations with the DA, with John Chisholm?
I don't want to comment on the specifics of any investigation, but I do think that being clear about where things stand when we're at a point where that is appropriate is important and is something we'll do.
I've got a few seconds left, not seconds, I've got a few minutes left, and then we'll take some audience questions. But we do have a number of law school students in this room, and I'd like to talk a little bit about your experiences because that might be of interest to them. So you were a federal prosecutor in Baltimore, and then you were a private litigator. What did you learn from those experiences that has helped you in your new role?
Well, first and foremost, I would encourage anybody who's a law student to think about what you're passionate about. Think about the types of law that you care about. There are, in all professions, people who I think may wish they had gone into a different profession, and law is no exception to that. But those tend not to be people who are doing something they're really passionate about. So I encourage you to think about what it is you love to do and want to do, and make that a focus of what you're doing. One thing I learned as a federal prosecutor is that getting into court is invaluable experience for an attorney. You have an opportunity as a prosecutor and some other capacities to make a real difference and to go into court and use the skills that you've developed in law school. Also, you learn about public service and the importance of doing the right thing. One of the great things about being a prosecutor is that your job is not to win the case fundamentally. Your job is to make sure that justice is done in the case that you are trying. That's an incredible opportunity. It's also an incredible responsibility. I certainly recommend that anybody who's considering working in the criminal justice system takes a hard look at it, because it's an area where there's a lot of important work to be done, and having talented, smart new lawyers entering into that field is really valuable. But as to the other part you mentioned, one of the things I was lucky to do was to do things I cared a lot about. I was a federal prosecutor. I worked in the narcotics section in Baltimore, which is
what kind of cases did you take on? I mean,
it's a city with serious drug trafficking issues. It's a city with
crimes.
Serious violence issues. So I worked on some cases that involved drug trafficking conspiracies. I was particularly interested in working on cases that involved violence because I wanted to do what we could to try to reduce violence in Baltimore and to hold accountable people who were involved in it, and often that related to drug trafficking. And as a voting rights lawyer, again, I was able to do something I cared deeply about, protect our right to vote and make sure that people, no matter their background, their race, their age, who were eligible to vote, were able to exercise that right. And so I've been fortunate to end up in a few different areas that I care deeply about the work we're doing, and I encourage law students to think about that and take that into account when you're deciding where to take your career.
Is public service that just is or isn't in your DNA? I'm wondering.
I'm probably not the right person to ask this question to. I grew up in a family that was deeply involved in public service.
And most of you probably know that his mom was the former Attorney General in the state of Wisconsin.
Yes, and my stepdad, Bill, was a police officer. My grandparents were public school teachers. And so from a young age, I saw the impact that you're able to have with public service, and I saw how much it meant to my family members to be involved in that line of work. So to me, the appeal of it was always clear. But I think it's really important that people who are committed to making a difference, to doing the right thing, no matter what your viewpoints are, that they get into public service, because having people who come together with the goal of making the state stronger, making the state safer, helping to build the future of Wisconsin, that is part of what contributes to a successful and thriving state. And so I think it's something that is in a lot of people's DNA, and I encourage people to pursue opportunities in public service if they have them.
I'm wondering if you got any advice as a young man as you were growing up from your your mom or your stepdad because they were public servants, and when you serve the public, you get the good and the bad. You get to do amazing things to help people, and you get to listen to people tell you you're no good and you're a terrible person and you did things wrong, and that comes with the territory. Did they offer any words of wisdom to you?
You know, a lot of it was learning by example, but I can tell you one thing that I know meant the world to my mom was that she did what she thought was right. And it sounds like a simple thing, but there are a lot of times when, you know, it might not be the politically convenient thing to do what's right. It might not make you popular to do what's right, but thinking about how this decision is going to impact people across the state of Wisconsin, how it's going to affect our institutions, our democratic institutions, and the rule of law in Wisconsin. If you come to decisions with that approach, someday down the road when you're no longer in public service, you're not going to regret that you made those decisions. And I could, you know, you could sense that if you talk to her, and that's something I drew a lot from. And so, you know, I'm sure there are people who would disagree with some of the decisions we made. You know, early in my term, before the lame duck legislation was enjoined, the governor asked us to withdraw from the lawsuit challenging the Affordable Care Act, and there were legitimate arguments to make that we could have withdrawn under the law. But I thought the best reading was that we were unable to at that time. I didn't want to be in that suit. I made that very clear beforehand, and since then we've withdrawn from the suit, but I thought that that was the right thing to do under the law. And I think defending our rule of law and our system, whether or not I agree with those laws, is a really important part of what the AG does. And so that's a decision I look back at and I'm proud of, because I did what I thought was in the best interest of our system. We were able to withdraw, so that also has a happy ending. We were able to avoid taking a position I thought was harmful to the state. But you know, those are tough decisions, but they're important ones, and I think it's critical that people in public service make those hard decisions.
Final question, what was the most challenging aspect of law school for you?
I think the first, for those of you who are first years, the first year is the hardest. Everybody will tell you it's your second year. You'll work a lot your second year, but just getting the hang of law school after your first year makes a big difference, and it's all going to work out well. It will all start making sense. You just got to put in the work.
All right. Let's take some questions from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone over to you if you're in the back, so hang on one second. We'll do that. If you're down front, you need to press down on the black little button in front of you so that we can hear your question. So let me see. Do we have anybody with a microphone in the room? Doesn't appear so. Oh, there you are, Eric. Sorry. Let me get this gentleman right there with the beard. And if you can keep your question brief. Yeah, thank you.
I'm just curious what you expect to happen in the redistricting debate we're going to see in the coming years?
Yeah, so the question is what I expect to see happen in the redistricting debate. So the litigation that went to the U.S. Supreme Court is now almost over, and that's a case where, as you know, the representative for the state, the Department of Justice is involved in defending the maps that are currently in place. I've also made clear, and will continue to make clear, that my view is that we need to change the system we have in place. I'd like to see Wisconsin adopt a nonpartisan redistricting model, much like Iowa has. And I'll tell you, that's a good idea in general, but it's a really good idea in our current circumstances, because Governor Evers will be in place when the next redistricting maps are up for a vote. And we don't know what's going to happen with the next legislature, but let's assume for the sake of argument it will remain a Republican majority legislature. We're either going to have agreement on a map, or we're going to end up with a lot of litigation over those maps. And that means more money spent by taxpayers on maps. It means a process that is not one where you've got a neutral group that's coming together to get maps that are in the best interests of voters, but rather people fighting over maps that are in the interest of one group or another. And that's not what I want to see. I'd like to see some sort of nonpartisan commission to come together. There hasn't been any progress made with those types of proposals yet, but I'm hopeful that as we get closer to the redistricting process, there's going to be a lot of pressure from the public on legislators to, instead of taking their own interests in account, take into account the interests of the voters and put in place a system to get fair maps.
Okay. Any student questions? Let me ask that. Anybody? Students? You're a perennial student. Let's see. Okay, other questions? Yeah.
Which button?
Just keep pressing down on it. We'll find it for you. Go ahead.
Anyway, I'm a retired trial lawyer, and I know from experience that one of the very best ways to get a case settled is to have a trial judge set a trial date and stick with it. And my question to you is, if the Department of Justice is ready to go to trial on a case and you have a judge who's willing to say you guys are going to trial next Tuesday if you don't settle, that is going to force the issue with the Finance Committee, with Nygren and those folks, and you're either going to get blown out of the water because they wouldn't consent to let you settle, or you're going to win one and you'll be happy with that. So I suggest take one of these to trial, or at least take it as close to trial as you have to get this strange law retracted by the Republicans.
Yeah, and I think that's what's going to happen, is that there will be cases where if we can't get some sort of settlement process worked out, cases are going to end up going to trial that would have been settled. And in some cases there are reasonable alternatives, and going to trial might be a logical approach. There are other cases, though, where Wisconsin is part of a multi-state effort, and there we are able to leverage not only the resources in our office, but in offices around the country to make sure that we're working together so we can do discovery and all the other things that go into preparing a case collectively. And if the vast majority of those states enter into a settlement agreement, we are all of a sudden potentially in a position where we no longer have the kind of resources you'd want to be litigating that case fully, and the state of Wisconsin may be in a worse position as a result. That's what I want to avoid, and so that's why we keep working to try to find some agreement. Hopefully we'll make some progress on it.
Other questions? Let me go right there, yeah. And then I'll go to the back up there.
I'm so glad you got elected. What do you wish ordinary citizens would do to help get out the vote?
Well, first and foremost, let me say, one of the things is that I think is really important is people get really engaged in the process of government around election time, and that makes sense, and it's a great thing. But staying engaged when we are not around the time of elections is really, really important if you care about seeing certain policies enacted. So, one of the questions before was whether I have any hope about universal background checks or red flag laws being taken up. The thing that is most likely to make that happen is having people call their representatives and say, we need some action taken on this. 4 out of 5 Wisconsinites support this legislation. It's time for something to be done. Legislators listen to their constituents. They might not always reach the result you want them to, but when a lot of people speak up and take action, that has an impact. And it's vital that people participate in our democracy. I don't need to tell you about all of the critical issues that are impacted by elections, whether it's climate change or health insurance coverage, funding for schools. I could go on. But talking about the importance of the issues, I think, gets a lot of people motivated to get involved, and it's something we need to keep doing.
Go to the back there. Yes.
Hello. Sorry, I'm in 1L, all of 4 weeks in. I was wondering if over the next 4 years you have any intentions of producing policy to address policing in the state?
Thank you.
So the answer is, I think there are a lot of reforms that we can potentially make to our criminal justice system. And I look at potential reforms in a lot of different ways through basically 2 questions. Number one is the reform we're talking about one that is going to keep our communities safe or potentially make them safer? And if the answer to that is yes, then the second question I have is this going to make our system fairer? And there is clearly room for improvement in the fairness of our system here in Wisconsin. If you look at our incarceration rates, the disparities in incarceration in Wisconsin, and I think there are a lot of areas where we can make improvement. I'll give you one example. Pre-trial release in Wisconsin right now is based on what bond is set. And when I was a federal prosecutor, this is going to oversimplify it a bit, but generally speaking, courts would look at one of a couple issues. Is the person a risk of flight? And are they a danger to the community based on their prior arrests and convictions, based on what they're charged with now? And if the answer to those questions was yes, they were likely going to be detained pending trial or put on pretty restrictive conditions. And if the answer was no, they were let out on much less restrictive conditions. It was a really logical system. Well, here in Wisconsin, we've got a system where whether you get out or not is based on whether you can meet a cash bond. And the bond varies based on those factors. But we had this standoff on I-94 not long ago, and one of the people who was involved in that standoff was able to pay her bail and was released and then tried to flee. So from a public safety standpoint, I don't think the situation we have right now is a good one. But also from a fairness standpoint, if there's somebody who's got a very low bond, but they can't get together the amount of money that they need to get out, they could be locked up on a very minor offense, but be spending time in jail because they can't get the money together. I cite that as an example of the types of reforms. When it comes to policing in particular, I'm a big advocate of community policing. I think that is an area where we need to continue investing and we need to continue developing what we're doing. I think that we get fairer outcomes, but I also think we get safer communities when people in law enforcement know the people in the community where they're working. They get better information from folks in the community, but they're also able to distinguish between a case where somebody may pose a danger to them versus a case where it's somebody who they've known for a long time, who they know is not a danger or may have a mental health issue or may be appearing to present a danger for some other reason. So I think we need to both commit to making reforms, and I'm hopeful our criminal justice, our CJCC, which I co-chair with Secretary Carr, will make progress on that front. But I think we need to do it with those two factors in mind.
Thanks for your question. And right behind her.
Hi, several of your predecessors have issued guidance to local law enforcement agencies about how to cooperate or maybe not cooperate with ICE. Are you planning on issuing that guidance?
So I don't believe, and I'm not aware of formal guidance that is in place. There have been some discussions. I'll say a few things. First, when it comes to immigration enforcement, the level of government that is responsible for that under our system is the federal government. That is not an area that is assigned to the states. And so I think it's our federal government that should be responsible for enforcing immigration laws, not our state government that's doing it. I also think that with the current manner of enforcement we've seen from the federal government, which seems to be indiscriminate and not focused on the types of considerations that I think the vast majority of people would agree you ought to be looking at in immigration cases, for example, whether somebody has committed a serious violent offense before or not. Participating in that approach to immigration enforcement is a really poor use of resources from law enforcement agencies. I would much rather see those agencies focusing on things like the opioid epidemic, like human trafficking, all sorts of other kinds of cases, rather than being sort of deputized to assist ICE in those sort of indiscriminate operations. So my hope is, and for the most part, I think most agencies around the state are not working with ICE. I know that that's not universally the case. But I don't think that that's a good use of resources for law enforcement agencies. I'd like to see them addressing the major problems we face, like the opioid epidemic.
Before we thank the Attorney General, I just want to mention something that's coming up. It's September 19th. We're trying something a little different from time to time. We're doing events, 90-minute events at 4:30 in the afternoon. Sometimes it works better for people's schedules. This one is going to be looking at upward mobility, and specifically the upward mobility of the Hispanic population in Milwaukee. Many of you know that virtually all of the population growth in Milwaukee over the last couple of decades has been in the Hispanic population. And yet we have not seen Hispanics move into higher paying jobs in the numbers that many people would like to see. There's a study that was done about that by the Wisconsin Policy Forum back not too long ago. And the study basically said that right now that we're not seeing Hispanics in this community moving into these higher wage occupations, and frankly that the educational achievement of young Hispanics is not sufficient to remedy that situation. So we're going to be talking about that as an issue. What do we do? What do we do differently than what we've done in the past? We'll have three people joining us. Joe Pietrangelo is a senior researcher for the Wisconsin Policy Forum. He was the author of the study. The study was commissioned by the Hispanic Professionals of Milwaukee, Greater Milwaukee. We will be hearing from the outgoing CEO, Griselda Aldretti, and the board chair of HPGM, who is Raquel Filmanowitz, who's an executive at BMO Harris Bank. So we'll be talking to them about what we're doing and why it's not working quite the way maybe we wish it would work. So if you want to join us, 4:30 on September 19th, that is a Thursday. Having said that, I want to thank everybody for being here today. Always appreciate your interest and your attention, and most of all, thanks to our guest, the Attorney General, Josh Kaul. Thank you so much.